There were a lot of things people accepted about Evergreen Springs, a sprawling community known for its manicured lawns and meticulously enforced rules. Residents often joked that if a leaf fell onto your driveway, the homeowners association would notice before you did. But no one really questioned their authority until tragedy struck at the annual 4th of July pool party. That summer afternoon started as a dreamscape of sunshine, the hum of a barbecue, and chatter among friends. The smell of grilled chicken and smoked sausages mingled with the perfume of fresh-cut grass. Kids splashed around in the crystal blue pool, while folks in their 40s, 50s, and beyond lounged in reclining chairs, soaking up the first truly scorching day of the season. Margaret Taylor arrived a bit late that day, as she often did, lugging a homemade potato salad in one hand and a folding chair in the other. She'd lived in Evergreen Springs for 5 years, having downsized from a bigger house after her kids had flown the nest. At 52, she found the calm of the neighborhood comforting, at least most of the time. She prided herself on being neighborly, if not particularly nosy. She knew the names of the children on her street and made sure to wave at everyone during her brisk evening walks. Yet she was vaguely aware that behind the glossy uniformity of this homeowners association, there were some baffling, even bizarre rules. She greeted a few acquaintances, some from the HOA board, including Patricia Stanton, who served as the board secretary. Patricia, a petite woman in her early 60s, took her role seriously. She was often seen with a clipboard in hand, patrolling the streets for any sign of overgrown grass or an unapproved color of mailbox. In truth, Patricia had single-handedly spearheaded a few policies that many neighbors found excessive. Among them was a rule Margaret had heard rumors about, a prohibition on administering the Heimlich maneuver at any official association event. At first, the idea had sounded so unbelievable that Margaret assumed it was mere hearsay. After greeting Patricia, who nodded curtly and disappeared toward the refreshment table, Margaret set up her folding chair near a cluster of her friends. Across the pool, she spotted Bill Leonard, a retired police officer with a frame that spoke of better days in the gym. Despite Bill's no-nonsense exterior, he had a warmth about him that put Margaret at ease. He gave her a hearty wave, which she returned, thankful to see a familiar face in this sea of sometimes standoffish neighbors. Music thumped lightly in the background, some retro hits that appealed to the older crowd. Waiters hired by the association walked around with trays of fruit kebabs and iced tea. It was, for all appearances, a perfect day. The water sparkled under the sun, laughter echoed across the yard, and the scene looked like it was plucked from a postcard. That was when the commotion started. It began quietly enough, no one actually saw him choke at first. The man, identified later as Robert Green, was in his late 50s and new to the neighborhood. He'd just taken a big bite of a hamburger. A casual neighborly chat was happening at the far side of the pool, and Robert had been laughing moments before. Then he stopped. His eyes bulged, and his hands flew to his throat. There was a split second where no one noticed. The next moment, a shrill scream from a nearby table shattered the contented air. Bill Leonard was the first to react. The ex-officer rushed over, adrenaline and training kicking in. Another neighbor, Emma Wu, followed close behind. "Robert, are you choking?" Bill demanded, but Robert could only shake his head in mounting panic. He tried to cough, but made no sound, a classic sign of a blocked airway. Margaret, standing nearby, felt her heart race. She'd taken a first aid course decades ago when her children were small. She knew what needed to be done. Someone had to do the Heimlich maneuver. You had to stand behind the victim, wrap your arms around the waist, clasp your hands, and deliver a series of thrusts to dislodge the obstruction. It was practically second nature in emergencies like this. But as Bill crouched to position himself behind Robert, a chorus of gasps erupted. Patricia Stanton appeared, eyes wide with alarm. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Stop!" Confusion rippled around the pool. Robert was clearly choking. How could anyone suggest they wait? Margaret's mind spun with the memory of the rumored rule. Was Patricia really about to reference that? It seemed unthinkable. Yet, Patricia's frantic gestures confirmed the impossible. No Heimlich. Patricia shrieked, her face tense. "It's against HOA policy." Margaret's stomach dropped. She thought she must have misheard, but the words repeated themselves in her mind like an echo. For a split second, no one moved. A wave of disbelief silenced the entire crowd. Robert Greene was still choking, his lips turning a dangerous shade of blue. Bill Leonard glanced over at Patricia, his brow furrowed. "He's going to die if we don't do something," he said, exasperation turning his face red. Patricia stood her ground, trembling slightly but resolute. "We can't afford liability issues," she insisted. "The HOA policy is clear. No Heimlich maneuver during HOA-sanctioned events." In that moment, the oppressive authority of the board overshadowed the immediate crisis, like a giant, menacing shadow that enveloped everyone present. The heartbreak and horror that followed would forever haunt the residents, carving a deep wound in a community that once believed it had everything under control. The seconds after Patricia's outburst stretched into an agonizing eternity. Bill Leonard locked eyes with Margaret for an instant. She saw a flicker of confusion, then righteous anger. Here they were, an entire community witnessing a man on the brink of death, and they were paralyzed by a policy. Margaret's heart pounded. Fear and disbelief wrestled for dominance in her mind. Did someone truly have the authority to stop life-saving measures? Was it even legal? Yet the crowd, so accustomed to following the HOA's every directive, hesitated. In that pause, Robert staggered, face contorted, chest heaving desperately. Finally, Bill decided. Ignoring Patricia's command, he encircled Robert from behind, locking his fists below the ribcage. The move was swift and confident, reminiscent of his days on the force. "I don't care what anyone says," Bill snapped, voice thick with urgency. "You don't let a man die." He delivered the first thrust. Robert's body jolted. The second thrust, more forceful, caused him to gag. It was the kind of reflex that might eventually dislodge the obstruction. Tension pulsed through the spectators like electricity. But all happened too slowly. Robert's choking hadn't started seconds ago. It had likely been half a minute or more by now. A chunk of partly chewed burger shot out of his mouth, but he remained limp in Bill's arms. Bill tried again, his face drenched with sweat. Robert's eyes rolled back. In the distance, a woman dialed 911, sobbing into her phone. Margaret, tears welling in her eyes, could hardly stand still. She stepped forward, wanting to help, but Bill blocked her with a quick shake of his head, wordlessly indicating he had it under control. He pumped Robert's chest in a frantic attempt to keep circulation moving. The crowd collectively held its breath. Finally, Bill let out a ragged cry of frustration, noticing that Robert's pulse was fading. "The paramedics are on their way," someone shouted. Amid the chaos, Patricia clutched her clipboard like a lifeline, her complexion ashen. She mumbled something about rules and liability, but her voice quavered, betraying her own sense of horror. She watched Bill continue chest compressions, almost as if she were frozen in place. The ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, slicing through the buzz of panic. Two paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside Robert's body. They swiftly took over, administering oxygen and hooking him up to portable monitors. A hush fell over the crowd as the medical team did their best to revive him. After an agonizing few minutes, they loaded Robert onto a stretcher, rushing him to the hospital. Bill Leonard followed the ambulance in his old Ford pickup, refusing to let the man face fate alone. The entire scene dissipated like a thundercloud bursting. The once jubilant party drifted into a solemn hush. People began packing up food and folding chairs, as if searching for any semblance of normalcy. But no one could erase the image of Robert's desperate gasp for air. Margaret found herself trembling. She sank in her chair and stared at the empty pool, water still shimmering under the afternoon sun, incongruent with the tragedy that had just unfolded. Others murmured in small clusters. Some shot accusing glances at Patricia, who remained rooted in place, seemingly petrified. Hours later, the call came in. Robert Greene was pronounced dead at the hospital. The paramedics had done all they could, but the prolonged lack of oxygen had taken its toll. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, arriving in hushed phone calls and grief-stricken text messages. Margaret felt a visceral sorrow when she got the news. She'd only met Robert a handful of times, mostly exchanging pleasantries about local grocery stores or discussing the best morning walking routes. She recalled his friendliness, the way he asked about her kids, and listened politely as she reminisced. The notion that such a well-meaning man had died over a rule, an absurd, unthinkable rule, left her shaken. That evening, Bill Leonard showed up at Margaret's doorstep, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She invited him in, offering a mug of tea. He looked like he'd been through a war zone. He explained that the hospital staff had praised his effort. Had the Heimlich been administered a bit earlier, Robert might have survived. The entire fiasco with Patricia's objection had cost them precious seconds. She literally told me to stop saving his life, Bill said quietly, disbelief in his voice. I can't wrap my head around it. Margaret's hands trembled around her steaming mug. I heard her, Bill. I heard her say the rule was about liability. That's just morally bankrupt. They sat in silence for a few moments, letting the enormity of the tragedy hang in the air. Finally, Bill stood determined. This can't be the end of it. The HOA can't just silence this matter. Someone died. Margaret nodded, a wave of resolve washing over her sorrow. I'm with you. We can't let this slide under the rug like some minor infraction. The next day, news of Robert Green's death lit a fuse under the usually complacent residents. Whispers turned into heated debates at the local coffee shop, in living rooms, and on front porches. People who had once grumbled quietly about HOA overreach started calling for accountability. They demanded an emergency board meeting. They demanded answers. And behind it all lay the horrifying knowledge that a fellow neighbor, a man with a family, had died at a community event in front of everyone's eyes because of an edict from the same organization that was supposed to protect the integrity of their neighborhood. 3 days after the tragedy, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting at the community clubhouse, a utilitarian building with gray walls and stiff folding chairs. The last time an emergency was declared, it concerned a spate of unapproved Christmas decorations. Now, the stakes were unimaginably higher. By 6 p.m., a crowd had gathered in the musty hall, filling every seat. A few people stood along the perimeter, unwilling to miss out on the proceedings. Conversations buzzed with tension, fear, and simmering anger. On one side of the room, Bill Leonard sat with arms crossed, his face etched with determination. Margaret took a seat next to him, gripping a notepad she had brought to jot down essential points. At precisely 6:05, the board members filed in. Patricia Stanton, looking visibly drained, sat at the center of the table. The others, President Alan Reed, Treasurer Melissa Gonzalez, and 2 additional board members, spread out beside her. They shuffled papers and avoided eye contact with the audience. Alan cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming, he began, trying to sound authoritative. We want to address the tragic incident that occurred at our 4th of July event, as well as the concerns raised by the community. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people whispered, "Concerns? This is a scandal." Others glared daggers at Patricia, who stared at her lap. We'd like to start by expressing our deepest condolences to the family of Robert Green, Alan continued. We're in contact with them and are doing all we can to offer support during this difficult time. Margaret almost scoffed. The official tone felt empty, especially after the role the board had played. She glanced at Bill, who clenched his jaw in frustration. Alan paused for effect, then tapped a small stack of papers in front of him. We are aware there's been discussion about our event policies. I want to clarify that the official rules do not specifically forbid the Heimlich maneuver. They do include a clause about discouraging unauthorized medical procedures during official events to avoid liability. But let me emphasize, nowhere is the word Heimlich maneuver directly mentioned. A wave of disbelief rolled across the attendees. Patricia's face turned red. A man in the front row stood up, scowling. Then why did Patricia specifically yell, "No Heimlich"? Sounds pretty explicit to me. Alan motioned for calm. We believe Miss Stanton may have misunderstood the policy and acted out of concern for possible legal repercussions. We want you to know this was never intended to stop neighbors from saving a life. A communal uproar erupted. Voices clashed, outraged. Bill stood, glancing at Margaret for a supportive nod. "I try to save Robert," he said, his voice resolute. And Patricia interfered. That interference cost precious seconds, maybe even a life. Patricia looked up, eyes brimming with tears. It was never my intention," she stammered. "I thought I was doing my job." After that lawsuit in a neighboring community, when a board member performed first aid and got sued for malpractice, the board decided to discourage interventions to minimize liability. I panicked. "I only meant to warn Bill, not," she swallowed hard. "I was thinking about the neighborhood's legal safety, not that it matters now." An incredulous hush fell over the room. Margaret felt a spike of anger. The entire community had suffered a terrible loss, and it was tied to a misguided, heartless policy. She raised her hand, standing slowly. "Someone is dead," she began, steadying her voice. "Don't we owe it to Robert and to ourselves to revoke any policy that risks human life? Shouldn't we ensure this never happens again?" A chorus of agreement rose. The board members looked frazzled, flipping through documents. Finally, Alan nodded. "Yes," he said shakily. "We, as the board, will be revisiting the entire set of policies, especially those dealing with medical emergencies. This will be done immediately." Bill, not satisfied, pressed further. "Revisiting is a start, but it doesn't bring Robert back. The community deserves an apology, not a whitewashing of the facts. We need a real, documented change, something that prevents any neighbor from being dissuaded from a life-saving act." Patricia lowered her gaze. "I'll sign whatever statement we need," she whispered. "I'm willing to meet with Robert's family and apologize personally." Alan turned to Patricia, paused, then faced the audience. "Yes, Miss Stanton will formally apologize on behalf of the board. But as to her individual responsibility, the board will hold a closed session to determine if any disciplinary measures are necessary." That word, disciplinary, rang hollow in the stale air. A life had been lost, and the best they could muster was an internal deliberation. Margaret looked around at the faces of her neighbors. Some were tearful, others furious. But within that crowd, she sensed a collective resolve forming. Robert's death was a line crossed, a break in the neighborhood's once unshakable complacency. People who had once turned a blind eye to the HOA's draconian policies now demanded transparency, moral accountability, and real change. The meeting concluded on an uneasy note. A few neighbors approached Bill and Margaret, offering condolences and vowing to help if they decided to take legal action. The board slipped away, weighed down by the backlash. Outside, the night sky hung heavy, the warm air thick with unresolved tension. Margaret and Bill lingered in the parking lot, talking in low voices. "Robert has a daughter in college," Bill said, eyes darkening. "She's going to be at the funeral next week. We owe it to her to show that her dad's death isn't just another statistic." Margaret nodded, her heart twisting at the thought of a young woman coming home to bury her father. "We should attend, of course, and speak up if the family needs us to. We can tell them exactly what happened. No sugarcoating." Bill sighed. "And after that, the board's going to revisit the policy, but who knows how seriously they'll take it. We need to keep pushing. Maybe we need to put some real pressure on them. Media attention, petitions, something. People should know about this. It could happen anywhere." Margaret swallowed the knot in her throat. She looked around the quiet parking lot, the warm light from street lamps flickering over carefully trimmed hedges. This place, once safe and orderly, now felt claustrophobic. "All right," she finally said. "Let's do it. For Robert, for his daughter, and for ourselves." News of the incident trickled beyond the neighborhood's borders. At first, it appeared as a small local paper headline. HOA policy delays Heimlich, resident dies. Then, a regional news station picked up the story. Soon enough, the tragedy became a talking point, circulating on social media under hashtags like #HOA gone too far. Margaret and Bill, initially just grieving neighbors, found themselves at the forefront of a grassroots outcry. They organized a candlelight vigil to honor Robert Greene's life. Over 100 people attended, including some from neighboring communities who had their own HOA horror stories. The soft glow of candles illuminated tearful faces and handmade posters that read, "A life lost, a lesson learned, and rules shouldn't overrule compassion." Around this time, Robert's daughter, Alana, came home from college. She was a tall, quiet young woman in her early 20s, wearing the kind of heartbreak that only comes from unexpected loss. Margaret and Bill offered their condolences at a private memorial service. Alana listened quietly as they recounted the details of her father's final moments. How so many neighbors wanted to help, how Bill had tried to administer aid, how Patricia's sudden outburst caused confusion and delay. Alana's stoicism cracked only once, a tremor in her voice. He always put others before himself. He deserved better. Bill and Margaret exchanged glances. They each recognized the guilt that gnawed at them, wondering if they could have acted faster, if they could have defied Patricia more decisively. But they also knew blame lay primarily with the system that allowed such an unfathomable restriction to exist. Robert's funeral was a somber affair. The entire congregation seemed weighed down by shock and regret. Some of the HOA board members attended, though they hung at the edges, unsure of how to approach the grieving family. Patricia Stanton was conspicuously absent. Rumors swirled that she was on leave from board duties, grappling with her role in the tragedy. Despite the sorrow, something else stirred in those who gathered: resolve. As if sensing this collective determination, Bill proposed to Alana that they share her father's story on a broader platform. She agreed. With her blessing, Bill and Margaret prepared to contact local lawmakers, consumer advocates, and any media outlets that would listen. Soon, a local NBC affiliate interviewed Margaret in front of her modest single-story home. The sun's fading rays cast a dramatic glow over the well-maintained lawns, a stark contrast to the tragic narrative. Margaret, her voice trembling with emotion, explained how the HOA's rule had paralyzed efforts to save Robert. She recounted Bill's heroic attempt, the frightened gasps of onlookers, Patricia's shrill directive. The interview went viral, stirring national attention. Anchor segments debated the question: can an HOA really ban the Heimlich maneuver? Reporters recounted similar stories of HOA overreach, though none quite so grim. With the community thrust into an unwanted spotlight, the Evergreen Springs HOA board hastily issued a statement. "We deeply regret the misunderstanding regarding our event policies. The board is reviewing all medical liability guidelines to ensure a tragedy like Mr. Greene's never happens again. We offer our heartfelt sympathies to the Greene family." Margaret read the statement online and felt her anger rise. The word misunderstanding echoed as a pitiful downplay of what had happened. Bill, too, was incensed. "They're covering their tracks," he said, tossing his phone onto Margaret's coffee table. "We need action, not apologies." With guidance from a local attorney, they created a petition demanding legislative reform. The petition called for the introduction of Good Samaritan protections that would override any HOA policy attempting to restrict immediate, life-saving measures. Support flowed in thousands of signatures, people from all over the state, some from across the country. One afternoon, while Bill and Margaret sorted through supportive emails, a knock sounded at Margaret's door. It was Patricia Stanton, looking frail in a wrinkled blouse and no makeup, so different from the immaculate, clipboard-wielding figure she used to present. Her eyes darted nervously as Margaret opened the door. "May I come in?" Patricia asked, voice subdued. Margaret paused. Her initial inclination was to slam the door, remembering all too vividly that horrifying moment by the pool. But some deeper compassion nudged her. She stepped aside, allowing Patricia to enter. They sat at the kitchen table. Bill, also present, stared at Patricia, arms folded defensively. She fiddled with a tissue in her lap, visibly uncomfortable. "I want to apologize," Patricia began, her voice trembling. "I know it's too late, and it can't fix anything. But I need you to know how sorry I am." I truly believed I was preventing a lawsuit that could bankrupt the community. I never intended to cost a life." Her voice broke. A silence settled over the kitchen, heavy with unspoken accusations. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What did you think would happen if Bill performed the Heimlich? Do you really believe a lawsuit is worse than losing someone forever?" Patricia nodded, tears brimming. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I realized how misguided everything was as soon as I saw Robert on the ground. The board hammered liability fears into my head so deeply, I lost my moral compass." Bill huffed, still resolute. "Apology accepted," he said coolly, "but I hope you realize we're not letting this go. We're pushing for real change. Not just in Evergreen Springs, but everywhere." Patricia nodded vigorously, tears spilling down her cheeks. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I've compiled every memo and email chain the board exchanged over the years regarding liability policies. It's all here," she said, tapping the folder. "If there's anything you can use to bring a case against the board's negligence, I want you to have it." Margaret's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Patricia gave a weak smile. "I can't bring Robert back, but I can help ensure something like this never happens again." She left soon after, leaving Bill and Margaret in stunned silence. They thumbed through the folder, reading disclaimers about increasingly litigious society and avoiding on-site liabilities. One email even outlined how to handle immediate medical emergencies with instructions to call 911, but to dissuade interventions if not performed by a trained professional authorized by the HOA. Bill slammed a hand on the table. "This is it," he said, voice trembling with a mixture of rage and relief. "Proof that they set this policy, knowing it could cost lives." Margaret nodded, tears brimming. "We'll use it. For Robert. For Alana. For every community that's ever been stifled by senseless regulations." Margaret stood in the dimly lit hearing room, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. The local Senate committee had convened to discuss proposed legislation that would mandate clear Good Samaritan protections in all homeowner association charters across the state. The measure was an unprecedented move, sparked directly by the events at Evergreen Springs. Seated beside Margaret was Bill Leonard, wearing a suit that looked slightly too tight around his broad shoulders. On the other side sat Alana Green, her gaze steady, her posture resolute. They'd come a long way, from a small suburban backyard fiasco to a legislative battle that could protect lives. The hearing was open to the public. News cameras lined the back of the room. Reporters typed furiously on their laptops. HOA representatives from various communities filled the gallery, some scowling, others curious. A hush fell as a state senator called Margaret to the podium. She took a moment to compose herself, memories of that haunting poolside scene still fresh. "Good morning," she began softly, her voice carrying the weight of what was at stake. "My name is Margaret Taylor, and I'm a resident of Evergreen Springs. I'm here to tell you about my neighbor, Robert Green, who died because of an HOA policy that discouraged life-saving interventions." She recounted the story, her voice catching when she described the moment Patricia Stanton shouted, "Stop," just as Bill had tried to save Robert. She read portions of the board's emails, the cold language that prioritized lawsuits over human life. The committee members appeared visibly disturbed. Some pinched the bridges of their noses, others nodded with grave expressions. When Margaret finished, Bill stepped up. He described his perspective as a retired police officer dedicated to protecting lives. He detailed the frantic attempts to administer the Heimlich maneuver, the fatal delay caused by Patricia's intervention. Then, finally, Alana took the stand. She spoke of her father, how he was a man who believed in community and kindness. She mentioned how, ironically, he had chosen Evergreen Springs because he trusted an organized HOA to maintain a safe environment. He believed that a place with so many rules must care deeply about its residents' well-being, she said, wiping away a tear. He was wrong. A low murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. The senator thanked them for their testimonies and opened the floor to questions. A representative for the state's Homeowners Association Coalition stood, adjusting his tie nervously. He tried to argue that the proposed legislation might force board members into complicated medical decisions. But Bill countered that the law wouldn't force them to do anything. It would simply protect neighbors from retaliation or liability if they stepped in to save a life. By the end of the hearing, the tide was unmistakable. The tragedy was too appalling, the evidence too damning. The committee unanimously advanced the bill to the full legislature. Applause and cheers broke out. Cameras flashed. Margaret, Bill, and Alana found themselves at the center of a media scrum. It was exhilarating and exhausting, bittersweet. Because while they'd taken a major step forward, Robert's absence was a glaring wound that no legal victory could heal. The bill passed in the legislature a month later, with a rousing majority of votes. It was quickly signed into law by the governor. The new regulations required all HOAs to adopt a Good Samaritan clause. Under no circumstances could they prohibit or penalize life-saving interventions at any community event. If an HOA tried to enforce such a rule, they'd be subject to legal repercussions. The outcome reverberated across the state. Some communities grumbled, others celebrated. But no one could deny that change was necessary. Meanwhile, in Evergreen Springs, the atmosphere shifted. Patricia Stanton resigned from the board, citing moral culpability. Several board members followed, some under legal scrutiny, others simply wanting to wash their hands of the controversy. Elections took place to fill the vacant seats, and a wave of more compassionate, community-focused individuals came into power. Margaret found herself unexpectedly nominated for a board position. Initially, she hesitated. After all the heartbreak, did she really want to immerse herself in HOA politics? But Bill convinced her that leadership from someone who understood the importance of putting people first could only benefit the neighborhood. With the encouragement of neighbors and even a shy thumbs up from Alana, she accepted. Late one summer evening, Margaret walked through the quiet streets of Evergreen Springs, passing manicured lawns illuminated by porch lights. She paused in front of the community pool. The water glistened under the moon, a silent testament to the tragedy that had unfolded there. In the distance, she could almost picture Robert's warm smile, or hear the laughter of those blissful hours before everything changed. She took a seat on a nearby bench, remembering the vow she and Bill had made. They had honored it. Change had come, but at a heartbreakingly steep cost. For a few minutes, she let herself grieve, tears silently tracking down her cheeks. In the midst of her reflection, a hush of peace settled over her. Though the price was high, Robert's story had galvanized thousands of others to stand up for compassion over liability, for moral courage over fear of lawsuits. Perhaps that was the smallest consolation to hold on to, the knowledge that his death, as unjust as it was, could help save countless others. Margaret rose, looking at the pool one last time. Tomorrow she'd wake up as an HOA board member, a steward of a better set of policies. She'd see to it that no neighbor was ever again told, "No Heimlich." She'd make sure that Robert's memory would remain a guiding light in the place he once called home. The end.